Hello, this is Jeffrey Williams, and welcome to Too Late for the Gods. Bernardo Kastrup is garnering attention with his revival of metaphysical idealism, especially among some Christian thinkers, and several of whom have appeared in conversation on this channel. This attention is partly due to surprise. Metaphysical idealism has been out of favor for quite some time and bucks a major trend in philosophy since the late 19th century. The abandonment of metaphysics, proclaimed by both Wittgenstein and Heidegger, among many others. And then, out of nowhere, Kastrup gives us a 21st century update grounded in modern physics and neuroscience. I agree with much of Kastrup's diagnosis of the spiritual malaise and the poverty of a world interpreted within the constraints of objective reductionism. I also agree with his description of the representational nature of our perceived world, seemingly drawn from Kant via Schopenhauer, and its modern neuroscientific update from practitioners such as Donald Hoffman. In the end, though, I still have to reject his relapse into metaphysics and implications of his metaphysical leap. Craig Reed, an interesting Christian thinker in his own right and a recent guest on this channel, interviewed Kastrup in a 2.5-hour live stream on his channel, to which I've linked below. Again, while I don't share Craig's metaphysical speculations, including any sort of theism, we do overlap to a surprising degree in how we interpret the world. His might be the most interesting of the interviews of Kastrup I have seen, as Craig got him to clarify his theist beliefs inherent in Kastrup's metaphysics. By the way, Craig, the doors of perception comes from a line in a poem by the great poet William Blake, the poem being The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. He was a metaphysical Christian whose insights align well with yours. You will deeply appreciate him. In this video, I will comment on the Kastrup interview via about 19 minutes of cuts winnowed from a 2.5-hour conversation, which I think present the essence of Kastrup's thought. I have broken this into 3 sections: argument, religion, and metaphor. In the video, Kastrup advances 2 separate arguments for metaphysical idealism: argument from physics and argument from psychedelics. He prefaces the first of these, the argument from physics, with a brief explanation of his concept.
When you train as a scientist, nobody talks about ontology. Nobody's talking about the essence of reality or the true nature of reality. Scientists are trained to be able to model the behavior of nature correctly.
Right.
And you can do that regardless of ontology, regardless of knowledge or lack of knowledge about what nature is. But in reality, most scientists are sort of running a little narrative in their own heads about what nature is. Their work is not about that narrative. Their work is about predictive models of nature's behavior, but they run that little narrative as a sort of a basic operating system that allows them to relate to the subject of their research. And in practice, the vast majority of scientists, at least the ones I have worked with, I mean, I worked at CERN, and the charter of CERN is to study matter at its
Right.
most fundamental levels. So their materialism was something you would breathe in the air. It was not something that was thought through or explicitly defined. And I would go further and say what's truly out there is mental, not in your mind alone, not in my mind alone, not in the minds of all living beings alone. It's a transpersonal form of mind that underlies all processes in nature and whose activity simply presents itself to us on our internal dashboard of instruments as what we call the physical world.
He starts out with a framework familiar to anyone familiar with 20th century thought, especially that of Martin Heidegger and his distinction of ontic and ontological. Objective scientific reductionism is a superficial description of measure and relationship of objects that describes how something works, but in the process closes off what things actually are. It creates a groundless existence that brought us to the point where we have forgotten what it is to have an authentic relation with the world in itself. The difference is Heidegger resists all metaphysical speculation and refers to this authentic ground of reality as being, an implicitly physical metaphor meaning the physical world as it is. This is in keeping with his contention, as well as Wittgenstein's, that metaphysical speculation is the great error running through the last 2,500 years of Western thought. For both, mystery, das Mystische, shrouded the true ground, but also calls us to it. Our task was to experience this mystery, express poetically what was revealed, or in Wittgenstein's case, merely point to it, and remain silent about what remains hidden. Kastrup, in contrast, makes the metaphysical leap of claiming the ground of reality as a transpersonal mind. Kastrup transforms the problem of inauthenticity stemming from epistemological reduction of being to objects into materialism versus idealism. By defining the objective world of representation as material, by definition, he also makes the world beyond representation, the world in itself, immaterial mind. We'll return to that definitional transformation later in the discussion. He then presents the first of his arguments, the argument from physics.
Yeah, we are very naive in thinking of our perceptual apparatus as a transparent window into the world, like a transparent windscreen in a plane. That's not what nature would have built. We wouldn't have survived otherwise. What we have is a dashboard of instruments. Perception is not a transparent windscreen, it's a dashboard of instruments. And matter is what appears on that dashboard. It's not the world as it is in itself, it's the world as measured, probed, and represented in a dashboard of instruments. That's what we call matter. The world as it is in itself is the thing that is measured in order for the representation we call matter to come into existence. There is at least a very, very strong case today to say that materialism is not consistent with scientific results over the last 40 years in foundations of physics and in neuroscience of consciousness. And idealism still is. I would say that empirically, idealism is the only game in town if your criterion is that your ontology should be consistent with scientific results and not contradict the latter. A premise of materialism or mainstream physicalism, which is a technical term, a premise of it is that the bottom layer of reality is physical entities, be them subatomic particles or fluids, whatever you prefer. But these physical entities are primary in the sense that they do not depend on anything else non-physical in order to exist. So we call this physical realism. Physical realism is a premise of materialism.
Right.
Now, physics, foundations of physics, has now sort of refuted physical realism because if physical realism were true, the properties of physical systems should not depend on observation. Observation should merely disclose to you the properties the system already had in and of itself just prior to observation. But as it turns out, that's not the case because if you have two entangled systems and on different ends of the universe or different ends of the earth, to make it a little bit more practical, what one investigator chooses to measure about physical system A changes what the second investigator sees about physical system B. Now, if physical systems A and B had physical properties in and of themselves, then what you choose to measure about A should not change what B is. But it turns out that what you choose to measure about one changes what the other is. Now, the solution to this is to realize that physicality is not the thing in itself, it's not the bottom layer of reality. It's just an appearance of a deeper, in principle, hidden reality. So in this
His claim is that materialism, which he equates with physicalism, is refuted by entanglement in that mere observation should not change the properties of physical entities, but since it does, he concludes that mind is more elemental than the physical entities. This makes some assumptions that are perhaps not warranted. The first of these is that entanglement requires consciousness, rather than consciousness might be just one occurrence of entanglement. We can't determine that because any entanglement we can know necessarily involves consciousness as we entangle with the measurement apparatus and thus the entire entangled system. Any entanglement we can know of necessarily involves our consciousness, but we can know nothing of entanglement beyond that. The second is the assumption that consciousness is not itself physical, perhaps as a wave or a quantum function would be. We are beginning to see inquiry into quantum mind theory by persons as serious as Roger Penrose. It very well could turn out that physicality is primary and consciousness a result of entangling with a subsystem. The third assumption is that entities have properties. A serious counter to that would be Carlo Rovelli's relational interpretation, in that everything we know is a perceived mini-system of relationships co-responsible for any emergent perceived properties. There are no innate properties, but rather everything is relationship. Next is the argument from psychedelics. I'll interject comments at several points during this argument.
mind would be scholarly irresponsible. And I think a lot of philosophers of mind today are scholarly irresponsible in the sense that they do not seek any direct acquaintance with the subject of their study, which is mind. They have very little introspective insight about mind. They turn philosophy of mind into a sort of an abstract puzzle game in conceptual space, which has very little grounding on the lived experience of mentation.
I could not agree more. This points to the poverty and superficiality of analytic philosophy, which is really just one branch of objective reductionism and forgetfulness of being. I also experienced LSD once as a teenager and psilocybin twice as an adult, and I find Kastrup's description interesting and accurate. Without a psychedelic experience, we cannot really appreciate how arbitrary, thin, and reductive our everyday experience is. He goes on to describe how our habitual patterns dissolve, our perception widens, and logic falls away as we appreciate the irrational nature of reality. We literally transcend our constructed sense of self and reconnect to something far more powerful and mysterious, and one which does, as Kastrup says, lead to increased empathy, understanding, and tolerance, and I would dare add love. I take these as valuable clues to the nature of being in humanity and perhaps the guide that directs the refinement of our moral sense.
I normally take psilocybin, the active
Okay.
ingredient of
And then,
magic.
did you have any type of spiritual type of experience with it, or what happened? Let's just say. How about that?
You transcend your sense of individual self. You transcend your rational mind. Logic sort of is left behind, not in a way that is purely irrational, but in a way that is a-rational, in a way that transcends logic, not in a way that denies logic. It shows you that there is more than just the veneer of logic, that mind can operate along many more degrees of freedom and dimensions, so to say. It is a life-changing experience. There is no question about that. It has been some of the most intense, enriching, mind-boggling experiences of my life. It's literally mind-opening. It's empathy-inducing. It's understanding-inducing. tolerance inducing. Um,
From this description of the experience, he proceeds to tell us how he deduces transcendent mind.
the biggest thing I took from my own psychedelic trips was the following: people, many people engage in a trip and they say, well, it was more real than real. Therefore, I was physically in another dimension talking to aliens from the Pleiades or something, because it felt like aliens from the Pleiades and it felt more real than this. Therefore, it was physically real. Well, no, that's not what I take from this. Because I know that when I'm on a psychedelic trip, I'm lying on my bed with my eyes closed, and my body didn't go anywhere. It didn't go to another dimension. It didn't go to the Pleiades. And neither there were physical alien beings in my room. What I take from it is the following: if a psychedelic trip, which is eminently and unquestionably mental, can feel much, much more real than this right now, and it does. It feels a lot more real than this right now. This pales in comparison to a deep psychedelic trip in terms of its sense of reality, its accompanying sense of concreteness and reality. This pales. A psychedelic trip feels a lot more real and more concrete. A deep one, not a low dose, Anyway,
Not a
but
weak one.
yeah, but what I made of it was very different. What I made of it was the following: if that was mental and it felt more real than this, then this is mental too. What reason do I have to think that this now isn't mental? Because I was in mental space unquestionably 24 hours ago, and I was convinced, more convinced than I am now, that it was real then. So on what basis do I now say that this is not mental? Well, it so this dovetails very nicely with the conceptual logical argument and empirical argument, objective argument for idealism, although it's eminently subjective. So it dovetails with it, and sort of it's the subjective mirror image to what is essentially a very objective empirical logical argument.
Um, do you think that what happened is that kind of your filters were taken down temporarily and you experienced to some degree mind at large? I mean,
I don't
that
think
seems
that
to me. Go ahead.
I don't think the filters were taken down completely, otherwise I would be dead. I think death is the image of the end of our dissociation. It happens when we sort of reintegrate ourselves into mind at large, into the world at large. But the filters were certainly compromised, and the dissociative boundary becomes more porous, more permeable, and things that you're usually dissociated from because of your inner storytelling, your inner narratives about who you are, what's going on, what's allowed to be possible, what's not allowed to be possible, and so on. Once that dissociative boundary becomes more porous, um, experiences stream in or you stream out, whichever way you prefer to put it, and you access a little bit of your surrounding world as it is in itself, as
Right.
opposed to how it is presented on the screen of perception, on the dashboard of dials. You get a taste for the thing in itself, the cognitive environment that surrounds you at all times, and which appears to you in the form that we call the physical world. But in a psychedelic trip, the dissociation is reduced. So instead of needing to to have the intermediation of the screen of perception to see that cognitive environment around you, you sort of become directly acquainted with it because the dissociation is reduced. And what is then the representation on the dashboard of dials of this reduction of dissociation? Well, it's a reduction in brain activity. And as it turns out, all psychedelics, psilocybin, DMT, all psychedelics, LSD, they operate by significantly reducing brain activity levels. They don't increase brain activity anywhere. They only reduce brain activity, which of course is uncomfortable for the materialists because if experience is brain activity or generated by brain activity, how can you have the most intense, rich, mind boggling experience of your life while your brain is effectively gone to sleep? So, materialist neuroscience, eh, because brain activity doesn't increase in a psychedelic experience, your brain doesn't light up like a Christmas tree. It just goes to sleep. Because of that, they have been trying to find out something related to brain physiology that increases during a psychedelic experience. And there is an open season for hunting for something that increases in the brain in order to safeguard materialism. And what they found, the most popular theory now, is what they call complexity and diversity and entropy, this pompous sounding words. And what they actually mean is brain noise. It's brain activity that follows no pattern, no identifiable pattern. Noise, just noise. And what they found is that in a scale from 0 to 100, on average, brain noise increases during a psychedelic experience by 0.005 in a scale of 0 to 100.
In responding to someone convinced he had literally traveled to the Pleiades, Kastrup states he knows he didn't actually go anywhere because he knows that he was lying on his bed with his eyes closed. This appears to me as an appeal to physicality, to establish reality from hallucination, and tends to undermine his reduction of everything to mind. If there were not the physicality of his body and bed, there would be no distinction between the two experiences. Yet there is a distinction. He concludes, if a psychedelic trip is eminently and unquestionably mental, it can feel much more real than this right now. If that was mental and it felt more real than this, then this is mental too. I wouldn't deny that this is a mental experience, but he had already distinguished between a mental hallucination and a mental experience of the physical by appeal to the physical. I would describe the illusion of spacemen from the Pleiades as merely the awareness of neural connections unconstrained by the default mode network, which is a very different process from sensed experience. As he says, filters not completely taken away, but compromised. Put another way, the real issue at play is reductive experience versus non-reductive experience, rather than material representation versus immaterial mind. A non-hallucinatory experience is a conscious connection to a real event received through the senses, but we can reduce it through mediation of objectification, or can more fully become conscious of the experience through aesthetic means, art or poetry, for example. But when authentic, it is something revealed through the senses, grounded in the physical. Psychedelics depress our objectification. He is right that we get a taste of the thing in itself, but that is a more immediate, non-reductive experience of this thing. The further step of concluding it is experience of a mind is a metaphorical interpretation of that experience, and itself reductive. He then turns to neuroscience to support his argument from psychedelics. This almost seems like he's trying to separate mind from brain in a return to duality rather than brain being the objectification of mind. If brain were our objectification, we would expect it to mirror the activity of the mind, much like his metaphor of tears objectifying sadness. There's a false assumption that materiality should increase brain activity. There's a fair degree of research that indeed shows some reduction of brain activity, but that reduction appears to center on the default mode network, DMN, which acts like the filter he describes. It regulates what enters our consciousness by filtering connections according to patterns, expectations, and preconceptions. The reduction of the DMN results in what some call entropic brain. Having a congenitally slightly depressed DMN myself, I have first-hand experience of entropic brain. This entropic experience is not really increased excitement, but the failure to order existing random neural connections. It's nothing like the brain going to sleep, but more like a napping DMN. For me, the most interesting aspect of Craig's interview is getting Kastrup to clarify his theism and call for religion. Somewhat incongruously, he starts off by equating mind at large with Schopenhauer's concept of will.
So the collective unconscious is what I call mind at large, taking
Right.
a hint from Aldous Huxley in the 1950s. So, it is what Schopenhauer called the will.
Schopenhauer adopted most of Kant's representational epistemology, only changing the categories from Kant's 12 to the one category of causality. His one important innovation was reversing Kant's metaphysical idea of will as pure reason and God into the elemental force of all physical reality. It was an important step along the way for the two dominant philosophical trends of the 19th and 20th centuries: eradication of metaphysics and the ascendancy of aesthetic knowledge over rational objectification. Nietzsche was later to make much of this, which in turn Heidegger refined in the 20th century. For Schopenhauer and later Nietzsche, will is the thing in itself, but disconnected from reason, which was purely subjectively mental. It is irrational and the most powerful and elemental force. It's described by Robert Wicks in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as frightening and pandemonic. He maintains that the world as it is in itself is an endless striving and blind impulse with no end in view, devoid of knowledge, lawless, absolutely free, entirely self determining, and almighty. As an aside, it could be Wicks, to whom Kastrup refers later in the interview as the leading Schopenhauer scholar who Kastrup believes in actuality understands nothing about Schopenhauer. I'll just say that in my careful study of Schopenhauer, I find Wick's quote above to be accurate. Schopenhauer thus turns the worldview upside down, and reality is physical, threatening, and randomly determined by an irrepressible force acting solely out of its own nature. Metaphysics is now merely a subjective idea, and along with that, any notion of a rational God. We will see later that Kastrup indeed accepts the indeterminate nature of the world in itself acting simply out of its own nature, but projects onto this a mind of God. We should note that this is an important contradiction to Schopenhauer's will as physical and mindless striving from its own nature. In effect, Kastrup seeks to reinstate the very metaphysics that Schopenhauer had played a role in overturning. Craig then leads Kastrup to explicitly equate mind at large to God.
Is mind at large and God, you have some empirical justification for mind at large, but to me, that's mind at large and God are like, that's almost the same thing. We're talking like tomato, tomato. I don't know how you see it though.
If I can play a role in helping revitalize religion in the West, I would be only happy if that happened, because I think one of the main crises we face in the West today is a religious crisis in the sense of a lack of religion. And I'm not talking about institutions and dogmas and moral codes. I'm talking about religion, a connection to transcendence, which we've had for arguably the best part of 2000 years. But since the 19th century, we've lost. Um, and that leads to all kinds of problems: nihilism, depression, lack of meaning in life, anxiety of all sorts. And I think that's an unnecessary suffering. That's unnecessary suffering True religion, behind the dogmas, behind the morals, behind the literal interpretations, true religion is a form of very, very deep philosophy. The Gospel of John is an idealist gospel. He was the Word. The Word is a translation for logos. Logos in Greek means word, but it also means thought. So
Yeah.
Jesus was God and he was thought.
Kastrup, I think rightly, sees the waning of religion as connected to the spiritual poverty that characterizes our existence since Nietzsche. But I believe he fails to consider the cause of that waning. The Enlightenment exposed the errors and unreliability of Christianity and thereby spread doubt. It resulted in a rejection of religion and an embrace of objective representational truth, which, without a replacement, disconnected humanity from an experience of the world in itself. Nietzsche deeply appreciated this crisis, as the madman in aphorism 125 of The Gay Science bemoans the ensuing vertigo overtaking the uprooted world and asks who will be strong enough to find a more authentic and true ground of morality and truth. Heidegger further develops this time of vertigo as destitution, taken from a line from Friedrich Hölderlin's elegy Brot und Wein. Und wozu Dichter in dürftiger Zeit? What are poets for in destitute time? They are for bringing forth the revelations of being, authentic reconnection of the world in itself through aesthetic experience. Until then, we continue in our uprooted state. Or as Heidegger put it, paraphrasing from Hölderlin's poem, we come too late for the gods and too early for being, whose just begun poem is man. We'll return to this later in the video. Kastrup then characterizes true religion as very deep philosophy. If it were presented as such, I could admit some value, but it claims absolute truth upon which your life and afterlife depends. Dogma ends any philosophical inquiry. I see two elements of religion that I think Kastrup naively fails to take into account: fear and ecstasy. He focuses solely on the ecstatic element, which is a search for and reverence of the holy. We see this in Craig's example of the Cologne Cathedral, in which I personally have experienced the awe of the mystery of being. That mystery is at the core of all such search for authenticity, be it as mystical aspects of religion or the arts as aesthetic connection to being. The interpretations of that experience are what differ, but not what is experienced, as Kastrup himself later attests. Fear, however, is the other element of religion, and arose prehistorically out of man's feelings of impotence in the face of overwhelming and deadly forces of nature. The response was to project gods who could be appeased for protection. This appeasement required worship and obeisance, and those who failed to do so endangered the entire community. As the ecstatic element of religion was mystery of the holy, the element of fear centers on the law. It is out of fear that dogma emerges, and from its law emerges intolerance and cruelty. Kastrup praises the fervor of the Muslim while dismissing the jihadist. In religion, the two are inseparable and inform each other. Much better that we move forward and not relapse into what we have already, for urgent reason, rejected. Kastrup then gives an idealist interpretation of sadness.
So tears are the material representation of the thing in itself, the thing in itself being sadness. So if you want to know, to have a concrete example of how these two things go hand in hand, think of sadness and tears on a face. Sadness is what actually exists. It's the mental phenomenon. It's the thing in itself.
Mhm.
But when you look at it from the outside, it will appear to your observation on your dashboard of dials as a contorted face with tears flowing down. Now, the tears are describable through physical parameters. You can locate the tear in space and in time. You can describe its speed, its velocity, the way it moves, its acceleration, and so on. But the sadness is not describable through those same parameters. How big is sadness? What's the length of sadness? How many meters does sadness have? How many kilos does sadness weigh? What are the geometrical relationships of sadness? What's the frequency of sadness? What's the amplitude? You see,
There are other possible interpretations. Sadness could also be thought of as a part of the essence of will in the Schopenhauerian sense that we experience aesthetically, or as the opposite of will, as our experience of denying will, as Nietzsche's Zarathustra saw it. It need not be a thought that is being represented. Being in itself has no weight or measure, which exists only in objective representation, but that doesn't mean that it is mental. Quantum field theory suggests it's simply waves of differing oscillations. That would be physical. Again, I see Kastrup making a non compelling metaphysical leap. It also seems at odds with his early example of brain versus mind in psychedelic experience, where he portrays a disconnection between the overly rich experience of mind with the depressed brain. In that case, the brain would be the opposite of the objectification of the mental reality. We will end the section on religion with the inevitable suggestion of life after death.
Or explained.
in life, we observe the world. In death, we become again the world. We are going nowhere. We're staying right here in this world. It's not a different world. It's not the other world. All these are metaphors for this world viewed from a different, non dissociated perspective. Uh, uh, when you are dissociated, you interact with the world through the dissociative boundary and the dashboard of dials that evolution has built for us to collect information about what's going on beyond the dissociative boundary. And we call that the physical world. Once the dissociation ends, you are exactly where you have been all along. But that boundary is not there anymore. The dashboard disappears. And now you will interact with the world by direct acquaintance, as opposed as through the intermediation of a dashboard of dials on a dissociative boundary.
In life, we observe the world. In death, we become the world. We interact with the world through direct acquaintance. What is the we at this point? If we lose our individuated experiences and the metaphors and narratives that bind them together, what remains? Losing dissociation would mean our annihilation. We could not directly interact with mind at large because we would simply be absorbed bits of mind. In the end, all metaphysical speculation is metaphor, and all metaphors eventually break down.
Um, it- I find it amazing. And what we forget is that, when the Jews exiled in Mesopotamia 2,500 years ago wrote the Old Testament, they were inserted in a culture in which this schism between literal and symbolic truth didn't exist. Uh, People communicated through metaphor and simile. That was all there was. The invention of literal truth, you could say, maybe it started around the Renaissance in the West or in the Enlightenment project. It's a question of 2 centuries, more or less, but not 1,000 years ago. It's a relatively recent
Right.
invention of the intellect, the separation between what's literally true and what is only indirectly true through metaphor, simile, or analogy, but could better be said literally. Now, this is a modern invention. It was not the reality of the writers of the scriptures. The attitude today is to control.
Yeah.
How do we predict nature's behavior so we can leverage it for our own little benefit, for controlling. I mean, this is what we've turned it into. We've turned it into a technique for control, as opposed to a avenue of wonder, which was the original attitude of science. We are
Appreciative in a life of gratitude and mystery. I think mystery is at the core of it all. I think that's what
absolutely
ultimately what we're talking about with transcendence is ineffable and it's hard to put into words, but it's that mystery that's the core of, I really think it's
exactly.
what it's all about.
My point is the things on the screen of perception, whose behavior we can predict more or less accurately, they are representations of the world as it is in itself. They are not the world as it is in itself. Physics describes the behavior of the dials, not of what lies behind the dials. What lies behind the dials is mental and not amenable to description through physical parameters, because physics, again, was invented to describe what appears on the screen of perception. Times.
Like you've even talked about how nature was trying to birth something through you with the books you've written, so you had to give over to it. That's a religious way of interpreting reality.
While I would disagree on when literal meaning became privileged over metaphor, Kastrup is here bringing up a crucial point. Metaphor is elemental to understanding and prior to literal meaning. I would go further and say it necessarily persists as elemental, even if not acknowledged. Science, and especially physics since Newton, has proudly proclaimed to speak and conceive in the language of mathematics, yet it always reverts to metaphor. This is what underlines Thomas Kuhn's concept of paradigm, and as he demonstrated, they always break down at some point and require a paradigm shift, that is, a new metaphor. Scientific metaphor and poetic or philosophical metaphor differ in direction and intent. Science uses a common word to simplify the understanding of something that is either complicated or perhaps even transcendent. It is essentially reductive. We talk of electron clouds or genetic code, although no such actual cloud or code exists, to create a concept of something beyond the conceivable. Poetic metaphor, on the other hand, uses common words to point toward and presence that which cannot be directly grasped. It is essentially transcendent. Think of the last verse of Bob Dylan's All Along the Watchtower, where the growl of the wildcat, the two approaching riders, and the howling wind, with their profound associations, give a chilling experience of an undefinable approaching apocalypse. But transcending what? Confined within a metaphysical framework, transcendence is supposed to transport us from the physical world to an immaterial world. The genius of the late 19th and 20th century thought from more authentic thinkers clarifies transcendence to be removing Kastrup's dashboard, that is, transcending reductionist objectification to non-reductively and in an unmediated way experience being itself, but not transcended to someplace outside of physicality. This is the reestablishment of the primacy of aesthetic thought, an overturning of Enlightenment rational objectivism. The true transcendence turns out to be, ironically, the overcoming of metaphysics itself. All metaphysics is reductive, and all reductionism is metaphysical. As Heidegger explained in The Question of Technology, metaphysics began when logos became logic. When A is A became A equals A, which obliterated the being in the is, which was inherent in the physical thing, and exported it to an imaginary ideal realm, leaving us with an empty equivalency in our perceived world. This underlies the control which Kastrup deplores. Metaphysics has turned the world of mystery to one of practical objectification, the world interpreted technologically. I would slightly disagree with my friend Craig here and say that it is the authentic way of interpreting reality. He and I have discussed similar experiences as musicians of letting the waves play through us. Heidegger talks of poetry as being speaking through man. This is the birthing of transcendent metaphor or music, but we need not equate it with religion, despite its essential action of revelation, grounding, and inspiring awe and reverence.
Right.
If we don't find a way to reconcile the core philosophical tenets of religion with our categories about what's possible and impossible, if we don't find a space within what the intellect allows to be plausible, if we don't find a space, a safe space for the core of religion that we can truly and honestly and sincerely say, this is true, then it will not have the effect.
But Western religion shares the same metaphysics as technology and will from here on appear false. My suggestion is to recognize the correctness but incompleteness of technological interpretation while reconnecting non-metaphysically to world in itself, with our innate capacity for aesthetic knowledge. As Friedrich Hölderlin wrote, voll Verdienst, doch dichterisch wohnet der Mensch auf dieser Erde. Fully industrious, yet poetically man dwells on this earth.
It's a language and symbolism and mythology. They are our ways to point, say, oh, this is what I mean there, right there.
Right.
So what you have to do is to not keep staring at the finger, but looking at where the finger is pointing.
That is exactly right. And in fact, pointing is the metaphor Wittgenstein used when he renounced analytic philosophy. Rejecting all metaphysics and endlessly meaningless discussion of the finger, he argued the only legitimate role left of philosophy was to point at things presented to us by the mystery. All dogmatic beliefs and systems are speaking where we cannot. He and Heidegger both saw that as a desecration of the holiness or mystery of being, which we are not equipped to grasp. Talk of gods or metaphysical systems is to desecrate through reductive dogmatism. Our only authentic path forward is to observe, experience, and point through transcendent metaphor. We are responsible for not allowing our limited concepts to reduce, distort, or obscure this mystery, but rather hold tight to the experience itself.
Now, the step that is happening here is from one set of quality to another set of qualities. The qualities experienced first person by mind at large, and the qualities of perception that I experience as a dissociated outer of mind at large. So you could say that the qualities of your perception are an experience of something else, an experience, an indirect experience of the qualities unfold transpersonally in mind at large, in the world out there. So they are experiences of something else, but that something else is also experiential in nature. It's so self-evident.
He adds, but that something else is also experiential in nature. If experience is experience of something else, and we are experiencing elementary experiential mind, what is that mind experiencing? Again, all metaphors ultimately break down, and it is imperative we guard against dogma, religious, metaphysical, systematic, and scientific. All we can do is point. The evolutionary drive, which science reduces to the metaphor of genetic code, is the most powerful and mysterious force in our world. It is literally immortal as it finds ways to overcome every obstacle to life. More than a code, it is life itself and our access to the essence of being. It is a force with intention, although not necessarily conscious. That it has an unyielding intention to further its existence is self-evident. The question is, what else might it intend? That is the mystery and the question of being. We interpret it differently, but when I listen to being, I hear an overwhelming physical force and speak from sensual physicality, sympathetic vibrations. I have no need to speak of mind because I hear no such thing when I hearken hard to the revelation and add nothing of my own. Perhaps within life there is an intention toward being evolving its ability to experience itself, and we are its just begun poem.